Hope everyone's morning is off to a great start. I'm Ayushi Gupta, a graduate student at the Harvard Kennedy School and the programming chair at the Behavioral Insights student group. On behalf of my team, I'd like to welcome you all to another BISG event. A little bit about us. We were launched in 2013 under the leadership of Faculty Director Todd Rogers. BISG brings together Harvard's outstanding group of research decision scholars, behavioral economists, and behavioral scientists to focus on improving how decisions are made by leaders, organizations, and individuals alike. With a member base of over 2,000 people, BISG hosts events throughout the year for students and professionals interested in powerful applications of behavioral insights. And we're really excited to have you all join us for today's session. It's an absolute honor for me to introduce Keith Payne, Professor of Psychology and Neuroscience at UNC Chapel Hill. Keith's research focuses on the psychological impacts of inequality and the ways in which our thoughts and behaviors reinforce racial and economic disparities. He is the author of The Broken Ladder: How Inequality Affects the Way We Think, Live, and Die. And most recently, Good Reasonable People: The Psychology Behind America's Dangerous Divide. In his new book, Good Reasonable People, Professor Payne draws on his personal experiences growing up in a working class, conservative Christian family in a small town, Kentucky, as well as his extensive research to offer profound insights on how our divisions shape not just our politics, but our relationships, communities, and our personal lives. Today, he'll guide us through the psychology behind America's dangerous divide and share the ways we can think about healing it. Please join us in welcoming Keith Payne. Over to you, Professor.
All right. Thanks so much, Ayushi. Thanks for organizing this and inviting me to be here. I thought I'd start by just telling you a little bit about the motivation I had for writing this book, which is that I basically couldn't stop getting into arguments with my family members over politics, mostly online, but sometimes also in person. And what would happen is, many of the members of my large extended family would often say something praising Donald Trump. And I would find that to be outrageous personally. And I would assume that they were either ill-informed or misinformed. And I would try to explain to them the reasoning and the evidence for why they were wrong. And being an academic, I would, send them links and references and magazine pieces to try to show them the evidence for why they were wrong. And of course, it never worked. Basically, we just got into a fight, and I saw them as, irrational at best and downright evil at moments at worst because they just wouldn't listen to reason. Maybe some of you have had similar experiences trying to convince people on the other side of the political divide that they should see things your way, and assuming that if they only had the right evidence in front of them, then they would understand the truth the way you do. So at the same time, I found those arguments incredibly difficult and painful and frustrating. My family members I was arguing with would sort of change the subject or move the goalpost or engage in whataboutism or, question the mainstream media where I got my information from, and all of these sort of slippery rhetorical moves that seemed to me like they were not engaging with the real points. And like I said, we're irrational at best and maybe evil at worst. And I know as a social psychologist about the psychology of in-groups and out-groups, about the phenomenon of naive realism, where we tend to assume that we see the world as it is, and if only the other side could see the same evidence that we do, then they would come around to our point of view, and that there must be something deeply wrong with them if they don't. And so I wanted to be able to step back, get out of the heat of the argument, and look at what we know in psychology and political science and social sciences more broadly about what seems to be driving our political divides, why it's so heated, and why it's so hard to talk about it in a calm and even-handed way. So that's what motivated me to write this book. And as I dove in, what I realized um, is that the actual empirical psychology, political science, and other social science behind this gives us a very different perspective on what's going on compared to if you're following the news media and watching political coverage of the election as a horse race, or talking about sort of political dynamics the way that our typical news media often does. So what do I mean by that? So if you listen to pollsters or journalists writing about the election, what they tend to focus on is political issues and political ideologies. So if they portray voters as splitting their votes based on what the issues are that they care most about, and whether they're for or against particular policies. And they treat people as having these relatively sophisticated ideologies. How many times have we read news articles about the way that maybe working class voters are becoming more politically liberal on economic issues, but more conservative on social issues, or the ways that different groups are becoming more left or right or moving to the center. And it portrays ordinary voters as if they're these sophisticated political thinkers. And when you look at the data, none of that makes any sense. So political scientists have known for decades that most Americans don't have anything like what we would call a political ideology at all, if we understand political ideology to be a coherently interconnected set of principles and issue ideas. So this research started with Phil Converse in a famous essay he wrote back in 1964. What he found, looking at years of survey data, mostly from the American National Election Studies, is that if you ask Americans what liberal or conservative mean, most can't explain what they mean. If you give them a multiple choice test, they perform close to chance. But maybe it's not that, maybe it doesn't matter that people can't explain or define what liberal and conservative ideologies are. They might still have an ideology, but just not be able to explain it in the way that an academic would find satisfactory. So Converse looked at people's opinions on different logically related issues. So for example, if somebody says they think taxes should be lower, then presumably they should also either believe that that government benefits should be lower, or that the government debt should go up. But it turns out that people's opinions on all these different logically related things are very, very weakly correlated. The people who take the liberal position on one issue are not very much more likely to take the liberal position on other closely related issues, and those who take the conservative position on one issue aren't very likely to take the conservative positions on other issues. Their opinions are simply all over the place, not tightly correlated. But still, you might think, well, people's ideology doesn't fall neatly along sort of a clear left-right liberal-conservative dimension, but maybe they still have a sophisticated kind of ideology that's sort of a maverick ideology that's their own code of ethics, if you will. And so if that's the case, then you would at least expect them to have their own constellation of ideas in a way that's consistent over time. But that doesn't turn out to be the case either. So if you look at people's opinions toward the same issues or the same principles, in repeated waves of surveys, what you find is that they're highly inconsistent over time. If people were to randomly draw agree and disagree responses out of a hat, they would agree with themselves by chance 50% of their 50% of the time. What Converse found is that they actually agreed with themselves over time, an average of 65%. That's better than chance, but not by much. So in the end, Converse estimated that the vast majority of Americans, 85%, have no ideology that deserves to be called an ideology. And he estimated that only about 15% do have an ideology. And that 15% tends to be people who are academics, journalists, people who work in politics or politicians themselves. And what you see is that those elite, politically engaged people tend to just talk to each other. So, you have journalists interviewing academics, academics citing other academics and journalists, and they all have this same set of assumptions, and they have these coherent ideologies, and they assume everyone else does too. But it's hard for people in that elite 15% to realize that the other 85% may not have any idea what we're even talking about when we're talking about politics. So that original research from Phil Converse was back in the 60s. We've become much more polarized since then. And so a lot of people have had the reaction that, well, maybe people didn't have much of an organized ideology way back in the 60s, but surely today we must have a clear left-right ideology. Otherwise, what are we divided about? So Nathan Kalmo and Donald Kinder recently, in I think it was 2018, published a book called Neither Liberal Nor Conservative, in which they redid all of Converse's analyses with data from the last few elections. And what they found is that pretty much everything that Converse found in the 1960s replicates today. So even today, most people don't have any ideology if an ideology is understood as a coherently interconnected set of ideas about principles and issue opinions. So then what are we even fighting about? Well, part of the confusion here is that we have this illusion of ideology, and it comes not just from the fact that academics and journalists and other elites tend to talk mostly to each other, but also if you look at people's responses on surveys in a single cross-sectional snapshot, which is what we typically do with polls, for example, at any given wave of the survey, participants will say something that sounds vaguely consistent with whatever their partisan identity is. So you might have Republicans saying they care about taxes and we should have tax cuts. You might have Democrats saying they care about abortion rights. And that all seems reasonable and coherent. The problem is, if you look at those same participants a few months later, they're likely to say a totally different constellation of issues and express a different set of opinions. Still, the Republicans might say something that seems generally consistent with Republicans, and the Democrats say something that seems generally consistent with Democrat policies. But they're not the same ones. It's as if they're just listening for whatever talking points they've heard recently and using those talking points to answer the survey. So this creates the illusion in cross-sectional surveys that people have this coherent ideology, but it doesn't seem to stand up over time. Even when we tell people about this research, most people find it hard to believe that people who express strong political opinions and get into arguments over politics don't have much of a political ideology. And I think it helps to think about a series of studies in psychology on a phenomenon called choice blindness to really hit home how much people can talk and give reasons that have nothing to do with the causes of their actual choices and behaviors. So in a choice blindness study, what happens is that the experimenter gives the participant a choice between two options, and the participant chooses one, and then the experimenter uses a magician's sleight of hand to actually reverse the two choices and present the participant with the option that they did not choose, and then asks them why they chose this one. And in a majority of cases, participants will not even notice that their choice has been switched, and they'll go on to give a totally reasonable sounding explanation for why they chose the thing that they didn't actually choose. And blind raters can't tell the difference between the reasons people give for options that they actually chose versus options that they didn't really choose. In some versions of this paradigm, the researchers did the same thing with people's survey responses on political issues. So people would say, I agree with a wealth tax, for example, or I strongly disagree with a wealth tax. Then the experimenter, using a clever manipulation that in which they switch the responses on the survey and then show participants their switched responses, found that, again, a majority of people didn't notice that they were presented with the opposite opinion to what they had actually expressed. And when they were asked, why do you feel this way about the wealth tax, they would go ahead and give perfectly reasonable sounding explanations for the position that they had just opposed a moment ago. And so what studies like this suggest is that the reasons people give for why they believe something or choose something are often not actually the causes of their choice. They're rationalizations or justifications that people make up after the fact to justify whatever seems reasonable at the moment. And I think the deeper we get into looking at people's political opinions, the more we have to pay attention to the difference between the causes of people's beliefs versus the rationalizations and justifications and the stories we spin to explain them or justify them after the fact. So there's two kinds of attitudes that are exceptions to the pattern I was just telling you about. This was found both in the original research by Phil Converse and in the more recent research by Kinder and Calmo, and that is attitudes that are related to people's identities tend to be stable and coherent in a way that all those other issue attitudes don't tend to be. And in particular, it's two kinds of identities that are especially stable, coherent, and powerful, and they're interconnected. So it's people's racial identity, including both their actual racial identification, but also their attitudes about race and their attitudes about racial inequality and why we have racial inequality. And the second one is partisan identity, whether they feel close to one party or they really dislike the other party. And those two things are highly overlapping, right? So we know that there are big racial divisions in our politics, but I don't think that we've taken them quite seriously enough in most cases. So how did we get here? If you listen to pollsters, they'll tell you about the issues, but I think we should start with the causes much further back. I think we should start with coccolithophores. These are the images here on the left of your screen. These are tiny single-cell organisms that lived in the prehistoric ocean 100 million years ago. So on the right, you can see where the coastline of what is today the United States was. During the Cretaceous period, which is about 100 million years ago, as you can see, the southeast portion of the United States was submerged, and the coastline went all the way up close to the Appalachian Mountains. And these coccolithophores were incredibly common during the Cretaceous period, and each little single-celled organism had a shell of calcium, which is what you see in these images here under a microscope. And as each little creature died and its calcium shell floated to the bottom of the seafloor, it created thicker and thicker layers of what became chalk at the bottom of the ocean. The Cretaceous period, Cretaceous is actually Latin for chalk. It's the time of chalk. That's what the Cretaceous period means, because these little animals were so abundant at the time, and they left their traces in many parts of the world. The White Cliffs of Dover, for example, in England, are made of this kind of chalk residue from these tiny coccolithophores. And in the southeastern United States, that coastline was especially covered in the chalk. And when I say chalk, I mean literally the kind of chalk that you would draw on an old-fashioned blackboard with. When you do that, it's the remnants of these microscopic ancient calcium shells that's flaking off onto the blackboard to write. So, why am I talking about this ancient coastline? Because so much of American history was set in motion by the fact of where that coastline happens to be. So it turns out that cotton is a plant that needs two things, especially. One is hot, long, growing seasons, and the other one is non-acidic soil. And the chalk, which is a type of limestone in the soil, keeps the southeastern, the soil in the southeastern parts of the United States suitable for growing cotton. And that combination of long, hot growing seasons and non-acidic soil that was made possible by that chalk made the southeast of the United States the most profitable place for growing cotton in the whole world during the 19th century and a little bit before. So what I'm showing you in the map on the right here is a map of cotton production in 1860. So as Southern landowners started farming cotton, it expanded, and wherever the cotton expanded, wherever the soil contained that chalk, the cotton growing tended to expand. And of course, wherever cotton growing expanded, so did slavery. So if you look at these two maps next to each other, you see the coastline there and the prevalence of cotton production there. There's a close connection between the chalk that was left behind on that coastline and cotton production 100 million years later. And of course, so wherever cotton production expanded, the practice of slavery expanded as well. And what I'm showing you here is a map that Abraham Lincoln used in planning and strategizing for the Civil War. And what it showed is the shaded areas in these counties indicate the percentage of the population in each county that was enslaved in the 1860 census. So the darker shading indicates higher concentrations of slavery. And the reason that Abraham Lincoln used this map for strategizing is that he knew that the states that were most economically dependent on slavery would be most likely to secede in the Civil War. Whereas the states that had some slaves, but not as many, like the border states of Missouri, Kentucky, and Maryland, they could be persuaded to stay in the Union. And that's exactly what happened. The states seceded in almost exactly the same order as the rank order of their enslaved populations. But this map isn't only predictive of which states seceded and which didn't. It turns out it's actually highly predictive of a lot of things that affect modern life today. So the places that were more heavily dependent on slavery in 1860 are today more segregated and have greater racial inequality in income and poverty rates than those that have lesser concentrations of slavery. And it's not just a broad north-south difference. You can see from one county to the next these differences that are still with us today. And so this patterning of um, slavery, in our own research, we found that you can predict today's level of implicit and explicit racial bias among white residents by the degree of slavery that was present in 1860. And political scientists Achara and Sen have found that counties with higher concentrations of slavery in 1860 have greater Republican voting among white residents, but not Black residents today. In fact, it goes the other way among Black residents. And so this is, of course, what set in motion some of the racial patterning of our politics that we still see today, not only in the South, but across the country. But if you look within the South, even on a county-to-county basis, you can still predict the level of Republican voting among whites and Democratic voting among Blacks by the number of slaves in that county in 1860. And so if you look at modern day numbers, of course, we know that there's a racial divide. In the most recent election, about 57% of white Americans voted for Donald Trump. About 85% of Black Americans voted for Kamala Harris. And if you look at the graph on the left, we've been polarizing by race more and more for decades now. Of course, before the Civil Rights Movement, the Democratic Party in the South was the party of segregation, but things started to realign and during the Civil Rights Movement, especially when the Kennedy and then the Johnson administrations pushed forward civil rights legislation. And that's when you really start seeing the racial realignment that has reached incredibly high levels today, with 85 to 90%, depending on the election, of Black Americans voting Democrat, and 55 to 60-something% of white Americans voting Republican. But it's not just the racial category that matters. That is predictive to a large degree, but even more predictive than people's racial category is how they understand racial inequality. So more than any other measure, a measure called racial resentment is predictive of how people vote today. I'm putting a couple of the items from the racial resentment scale on the screen here, because I think when we call it racial resentment, I don't think that's the most descriptive name for this measure. It's not really about resenting people based on race, in my view, at least. If you look at what the actual items measure, and this is 3 out of the 4 items, the items say things like Irish, Italian, and Jewish ethnicities overcame prejudice and worked their way up. Blacks should do the same without any special favors. Or it's really a matter of some people just not working and not trying hard enough. If Blacks would only try harder, they could be just as well off as whites. And then there's a reverse item, a reverse scored item that says generations of slavery and discrimination have created conditions that make it difficult for Blacks to work their way out of the lower class. So people who score high on this racial resentment scale, they're not really saying, I resent Black people. What they're saying is, in my view, my understanding of racial inequality is that Black people don't work hard enough. They're denying the impact of racism, discrimination, systemic racism, and just asserting that it's a level playing field. There are no starting inequalities, so Black people should just work harder. And if there's still racial inequality, it's just because Black people aren't working hard enough. And it turns out that this is an incredibly powerful predictor of our political divisions today. What I'm showing you here is data from the National Election Studies. This is 2020 data. We don't have the data from the new one yet. But how people score on that racial resentment scale is correlated with how they voted. And it's higher than a 0.6 correlation. It's so rare to see such strong correlations in behavioral science like this. But if participants agreed or strongly agreed with those racial resentment items, they were more than 90% likely to vote for Trump. If they agreed, strongly disagreed or disagreed, they were less than 10% likely to vote for Trump. And if you simply take two variables from the National Election Studies data, the participants' racial category and their score on this racial resentment scale, you can predict with 85% accuracy how people voted. That's remarkable. It's by far stronger than any other of the predictors that I've seen in that data set. And if you add other issue positions that we would think would be predictive, things like people's positions on taxes or climate change or abortion rights, all of these add a tiny percent more, but very, very little in terms of the prediction of how people vote. You can explain the lion's share of people's political polarization simply based on race plus racial resentment. So why is it that race and racial identity has come to so define our politics? Well, I think the basic insight has been with us a long time, since Henry Tajfel developed social identity theory. He argued that, you know, the point of dividing ourselves into in-groups and out-groups is that the groups we belong to provide a source of identity, a source of self, and a source of self-esteem, so that the groups that belong the most to us are what buffer our sense of self and being a good, reasonable person. So what I call the psychological bottom line is this insistence that we all have that I'm a good, reasonable person, and the groups that I belong to are too. And every new piece of information we encounter, every new argument we encounter, has to be processed in a way that adds up to be consistent with this psychological bottom line, that I'm a good, reasonable person, and the groups I belong to are too. And so it's not that people don't reason their way to their political beliefs. They do. We all feel that we have reasoned our way to our own political beliefs. But we can predict from the outside which reasons people will find compelling if we know just their race and their racial resentment score. And of course, racial resentment is one of those variables that can be predicted by the prevalence of slavery, and can be predicted by the prevalence of cotton, and can be predicted by the distribution of coccolithophores creating chalk in the soil 100 million years ago. Okay, so if we take seriously this identity-based account of why we're so polarized, and why our partisanship revolves around our racial identity, then it sheds light on a couple of other sources of divides that we talk about a lot. I'm not gonna, I go through lots of them in the book. I'm just going to take time to do two of them right now. One is the idea of misinformation and the idea that we're in a crisis of misinformation and conspiracy theories. On the one hand, that's true. Misinformation really is rampant. But what we don't often realize is that it always has been. Ushinsky and colleagues and Enders and colleagues published a couple of papers in the last few years that point out that belief in conspiracy theories is pretty much constant over time since at least the 1970s, which is the earliest data that we have good representative samples of beliefs in conspiracy theories. The particular theories that are popular at one time or another change, of course. You know, in the 90s, there were lots of conspiracy theories about O.J. Simpson. If you ask young people today about O.J. Simpson, they say, "Who's that?" The content of the conspiracy theories change, but the gist of them doesn't. And the biggest predictor of which conspiracies people believe in is who the villain is. So if you tell the average Democrat that Republicans are in league with the banks to nefariously benefit themselves, they tend to believe it. And if you tell Republicans that the Democrats are in league with the pharmaceutical companies to nefariously rig the election, people will believe that. Republicans will believe that. And so there's been a ton of research over the last 5 years or so looking at the prevalence of misinformation and how to correct it. And what I think is the most interesting, though, is the fact that you can correct false beliefs. Feedback, fact checks, corrections, they work, at least in the short term, but it doesn't change partisan support. On the other hand, partisan support does predict which conspiracies or misinformation people are willing to endorse. One of my favorite studies in this genre found that when Facebook had an outage and went down for about a day, it's not that the overall rate of misinformation belief went down. It just increased the amount of searches people engaged in for false information that they wanted to hear on other sites like InfoWars. So I think the best way to think about the misinformation phenomenon is what philosopher Dan Williams calls rationalization markets. Rationalization markets. The idea is that there's both supply and demand for false information, that we as partisans, we want to be told both true and false information that is consistent with our identities. And as long as there's that demand, there will always be suppliers that pop up to meet that demand, whether it's partisan news or podcasts or fake news memes, etc. So it's both a give and take based on both supply and demand. And the basic upshot of this area of research is that, we so often worry about misinformation because we think people will vote in a bad way if they're misled. They'll vote for the wrong candidate because they've been lied to. But most of these studies, in my view, seem to be showing that people don't largely vote because of what they believe. They believe what they believe because of how they want to vote. It's, again, a rationalization rather than a cause in many cases. And so the picture emerging from this literature is that we have this core identity or set of identities, and we insist on keeping those intact, and we defend it with rationalizations in terms of what we believe, in terms of issue opinions, in terms of misinformation, but also true information. And one way to think about it is that for the vast majority of the population, the people who don't necessarily have what we would consider a coherent ideology, we're just winging it, making up stories, spinning rationalizations as needed to justify our sense that we're good and reasonable people, and the groups we belong to are as well. And the final source of division I want to comment on is what's become known as the diploma divide. So in the most recent election, about 66% of white voters with no college degree voted for Donald Trump, whereas only 45% of white Americans with a college degree voted for Donald Trump. By the way, this diploma divide is entirely among white voters. You don't see an education divide among non-white voters. And I think it's interesting how often we talk about quote unquote working class voters, which is a vague and fuzzy term, working class. It implies maybe that people work with their hands. It implies maybe that people have a low income. But the way pollsters actually measure this and operationalize it in most cases is simply whether voters have a college degree or not. So if you look at data like the National Election Studies data and predict votes with both income and education, they actually work in opposite directions. So higher education is predictive of voting for Democrats, but higher income is predictive of voting for Republicans. So this idea that the quote unquote working class vote Republican is only true if you're talking about education, and it's the opposite if you're talking about income. But how do we explain the diploma divide? Well, it's popular to talk about on the right how universities are indoctrinating students, because it's true, college graduates are much more liberal, right, than people who haven't gone to college. But several interesting studies have looked at that and found very little evidence that going to college causes students to become more liberal. Instead, what seems to be going on is that liberal families send their kids to college at higher rates than conservative families do. And so we have a sorting effect. College students show up on campus more liberal than conservative, and they leave that way as well. So it's a sorting effect, not an education effect in most cases. The one exception to that pattern seems to be that going to college does have some causal influence in terms of reducing prejudice and creating more egalitarian racial attitudes. And there seem to be two pathways through which that works. One is education itself, learning about the concept of systemic racism, learning about the history of oppression and segregation in the United States. And the second pathway is through informal social experiences that people have. For most people, when they show up on a college campus, it's the most diverse place they've ever lived. And so having experiences with a more diverse set of people from all different races and ethnicities and often all around the world seems to contribute to more racial egalitarian attitudes. So in a way, the diploma divide, to the extent that there's a causal effect, again comes back to the racial identity divide. Oh, I said I was going to talk about two. I have notes here for one more. Just briefly, the religion divide. It's often assumed that the religious divide that we have is because people are born into a conservative evangelical religion and they tend to become Republicans, or they're born into a liberal religion or a non-religious family and they tend to become Democrats. A book by Margolis in 2018 is a fabulous resource for understanding how this actually unfolds over time. Basically, what happens is that in early adolescence, most kids start distancing themselves from whatever religion their parents are. And then in late adolescence, that's when people start forming their political identity and start feeling drawn more to liberals or conservatives, Democrats or Republicans during that period in which they're at their furthest from religion. A little bit later, when people enter into adulthood, and especially if they start having children, they tend to return to considering some form of religion. And if they've become Republicans in that interim, they tend to move toward more evangelical conservative forms of religion. And if they've become a Democrat, they tend to be drawn to more liberal forms of religion or away from religion at all. So again, it's not simply that religion is causing partisan identities. It's that the partisan identities that we form during adolescence lead us to adopt more or less conservative forms of religiosity or non-religiosity. Okay, so I've talked about many of the sources of our divides. I just want to talk a little bit about what we know from this identity-based perspective about how to have better conversations. First of all, one piece of good news is that there's more common ground than we think, in part because we don't have such rigid political ideologies. We're actually less divided on issues than we often suppose. Number two is that we need to stop trying to bludgeon others into submission with our facts and our logic, because that's not how this works. We use whatever facts and logic are useful to us in order to defend our psychological bottom line that we're a good, reasonable person and our groups are too. Instead, what I think is more helpful next time you are tempted to get into an argument with somebody over politics, ask how the other person is using their beliefs to defend that psychological bottom line, and how are you doing the same? It won't necessarily make you agree, it probably won't, and it probably shouldn't, but now you're one person doing the best they can to understand this complicated world from the perspective that you have, which is your own, and you see them as just another person trying to do the same. And I think that is the best we can hope for in terms of turning down the temperature so that we can fight about these ideas with votes and words instead of bullets and violence. So I will stop there, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Keith. This was a very, very enlightening talk. We have a couple of questions, and I've tried my best to kind of categorize them by theme. So maybe I'll just start reading them out to you, and we can take them one by one. I think the one question regarding perhaps your overall presentation was that it suggests that people's political affiliation beliefs are largely stable, and yet from data from like recent elections suggests that many people's political affiliations, even along racial lines, have changed of late. So how do you kind of account for that, and how do you reconcile those?
Well, I'm not sure what data is being referred to there, but I think what we may be seeing here is this tendency to look at the way that an election flips back and forth from one cycle to the next and think that that's representative of the population as a whole. But what we actually have is about 75 million people who would never vote for a Republican, and about 75 million people who would never vote for a Democrat. And that is about, 98% or 97% of the country. And then we have about 3% in the middle that swing back and forth, who probably don't pay much attention to the news, who probably don't have much of not only an ideology, but even a partisan identity. And those people switch back and forth enough to swing the election. But that's not describing why the 75 million on each side are so entrenched the way they are.
Right. And regarding, you've spoken a little bit about misinformation, and you've said that conspiracy theories have largely existed, and it's what we believe is we believe what we believe, and conspiracy theories might not be as effective in changing those beliefs. But we're at a time where, of course, conspiracy theories have existed always, but we're also in the realm where they're actively endorsed and costlessly endorsed. And so, against this, how do we as individuals kind of navigate these platforms in a healthier way? And I think along those lines, how do we overcome our own confirmation bias, and what are some of the most effective means?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think um, it it's it took me a long time to wrap my head around the empirical literature on conspiracy theories because it seems so salient to me, any of us who are on social media and things like that, that there are so many ridiculous conspiracy theories, and they seem to me to mostly be among Republicans. And I think the difference there is not the difference between Republican voters and Democratic voters. The main difference is Donald Trump, right? Who's more willing to say more absurd things than any other candidate that we've ever seen. And so he had the key political insight that there's literally no limit to the lies people are willing to accept if it's in service of their social identities. So the second part of your question is, if how can we overcome confirmation bias ourselves? One strategy from the decision-making literature that I really like is called consider the opposite. So what happens with the confirmation bias is that we sort of unconsciously consider evidence, seek out evidence that confirms what we already believe or want to believe. So you can consciously say, well, what would it take to change my mind? What if the opposite of what I believe is true? So just entertaining the opposite is enough to moderate it, even if it may not make it go away altogether.
Thank you. That was a very insightful response. There were a few questions that were very specific, which we can get to towards the end of this chat, but there were some on the lines of looking forward, and I think that's a great way to think especially at the time we're in. What are some of the biggest challenges you kind of foresee in reducing political and social divides, and how can we prepare for or overcome them?
Right. So yeah, it's very hard. I think I wish I knew the answer to how we could overcome our political divides, and
Yeah.
but unfortunately, I think if anybody says they have the answer, you probably shouldn't assume they're telling you the truth at this point, because this is what the answer we would all like to have, right? And the reason it's so hard is because what's happening is that the country is diversifying. Um, white Christians used to be something like 90% of the electorate, and now they're 50 or something like that, 50, 60%. White Americans used to be 90% of the electorate, and now they're only 70%. And so as the country diversifies, the shrinking majority of white Americans is shifting more and more to the right. Right. And so there's this dance that's going on. And this is why we're so incredibly evenly divided election after election. It's just 50%, 50%, or, 48% on this side, 48% on that side, and a few percent that swings in the middle. It's that Republicans are appealing more and more to racial grievance as a way of getting a larger and larger percent of the white vote, even as the electorate gets more and more diverse over time. And so those two things are happening at the same rate and kind of canceling each other out. And eventually, there's not going to be enough relatively low education white Americans to win those elections. But right now, there still is. And it's a very scary time for the country because it forces Republicans at some point to choose between maintaining power and maintaining a democracy, because they're only going to be able to maintain viability by either changing what the party stands for or finding some way to enshrine minority rule. And so which way that's going to go, are we going to be able to become a true multiracial democracy and keep our democracy, that's what keeps me up at night.
In terms of, in the spirit of looking forward again, if the principles outlined in the Good Reasonable People were widely adopted, what changes would you hope to see in how we engage politically and socially over the next decade?
Right. It's a good question. So I think if we learn to think about our political opponents as just people doing the best we can to make sense of the world from our own perspectives, then one thing I would hope to see is a reduction in political violence. It's been increasing, especially on the right, for the last 10 years or so. And so I don't expect us to start agreeing with each other, and I don't think we should. I think these are issues that are important and that are worth fighting for, but that we should fight with votes, right? Rather than with violence. And that's the main thing I want to see, because the trends on political violence are in the wrong direction. And that's, political outcomes are interesting because since 2012, we've simply bounced back and forth to whoever wasn't the incumbent party, right? So it's not like one party can achieve dominance right now. But I think that the goal should be to calm down the temperature so that we can disagree with each other without having violence.
Well, here's hoping. And I think I have time to squeeze in another question. We've been getting a fair few. But there was one specific question that wanted to tap into your insights of kind of this discrepancy that Massachusetts seemed to have been seeing. They say they were asking on about how your data shows that people are locked in into their voting patterns. However, Massachusetts is considered to be a democratic liberal state, yet we've had more Republican than Democratic governors. And so they wanted to kind of tap into what your thoughts are regarding this kind of discrepancy.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. That sort of split ticket voting is interesting. So on the one hand, Massachusetts is politically liberal on average, but on the other hand, it's very white on average, right? And so uh, even in more politically liberal places, you still have a majority of white Americans voting Republican in most places. I'm not sure about that if that's the case in Massachusetts. But it's just a smaller majority of whites voting Republican, which is offset by the proportion of non-whites voting Democrats. All right. So in terms of the specific issue of split ticket voting, we see that a lot in North Carolina too. We have had a series of Democratic governors, even though we're voting for Republican presidential candidates. Again, the aggregate results can be misleading. Most people don't split their votes. It's something like, in North Carolina at least, something like 12 or 15% of people do. And that's enough because the numbers are so close. It's so close to 50-50 that a small percentage of people who split their ticket for the president versus the governor is enough to create a split ticket outcome. So I think that's probably what's happening.
Right. Well, I think that also brings us to time. Thank you so much, Keith, for taking out your time to speak with our members and the community at BISG. This talk was incredibly engaging and left us to ponder a little more about our actions and how we are engaging with the world today. So thank you again, and thank you to everybody who tuned in. We're really excited to have you here, and BISG continues to host a lot of events. And so do keep an eye out for the upcoming book series talks we have in line. But thank you, everybody, and hope everybody has a great day.
Yeah. Bye, everybody.
Thanks. Bye.